My daughter-in-law laughed, while my son forced him out after 42 years in my home. And somehow, that wasn't even the part that hurt the most. What shattered me was the way my son avoided looking into my eyes while I packed away the sweaters his father used to wear. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply carried my boxes to the car and left. 3 days later, their laughter stopped. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end. And comment on the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The dining room still smelled faintly of rosemary, chicken, and candle wax when Daniel told me I had to leave. I remember that detail because my mind clung to small things that night. The flickering candle beside the salt shaker. The ticking grandfather clock Richard bought at an estate sale in 1994. The untouched peach cobbler cooling on the kitchen counter. Tiny things felt safer than the truth sitting across from me. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, swirling red wine slowly in her glass, as though she were enjoying a show at the theater instead of watching her husband throw his own mother out of the home she'd spent most of her life building. "It's just too much house for you now, Evelyn," she said smoothly. "You should be somewhere easier. That word settled into my chest like ice. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table before answering. At 68, I had learned that humiliation always became uglier when witnessed by someone desperate for a reaction. "This house has been my home for 42 years, I said quietly. Daniel sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead the way he always did when he wanted to avoid discomfort. "Mom, we've talked about this." No, they had talked about it. Mostly in lowered voices, behind closed doors. Mostly after they thought I'd gone upstairs for the night. Over the past few months, I had started noticing little things disappearing from my routine. Mail arriving already opened. My favorite chair moved from the living room into the den without explanation. Vanessa referring to the upstairs bathroom as our bathroom instead of the guest bathroom. At first, I convinced myself grief was making me sensitive. Richard had only been gone 8 months. 8 months since the heart attack that stole him from me on a quiet Tuesday morning while he watered the hydrangeas near the porch. 8 months since I held his cold hand in the emergency room and listened to a doctor explain that sometimes the body simply gives out before the heart is ready. After 42 years together, silence became its own kind of violence. The house felt wrong without him in it. Too quiet, too large, too empty. And somehow, despite all that emptiness, there still wasn't room for me anymore. Vanessa crossed one elegant leg over the other and smiled thinly. "You can stay with Patricia for a while," she said. "Arizona will probably be good for you. Good for me." As if I were an aging dog being relocated somewhere warm. I looked at Daniel then, really looked at him. At the little boy who used to wait by the window every evening for his father to come home from work. The same boy who once cried for 2 straight hours when I left him at kindergarten. He couldn't even meet my eyes now. "Is this what you want?" I asked softly. His jaw tightened. "We need space, Mom. We, not him. We." Vanessa's hand slid onto his wrist immediately, almost possessively. The gesture told me everything. The room fell quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then Vanessa laughed, not loudly, not cruelly enough for anyone else to call it cruelty. Just a soft little laugh under her breath, while I sat there trying to absorb the fact that my own son wanted me gone. That tiny sound broke something inside me far more completely than Daniel's words ever could. Because laughter meant comfort, ease, enjoyment. She wasn't uncomfortable doing this to me. She liked it. I stood slowly, my knees aching slightly as I pushed back the dining chair. For a second, Daniel looked nervous, as if he expected me to scream or throw something dramatic across the room. But I was too tired for drama, Grief drains anger out of a person eventually. What remains is something colder. All right, I said calmly. Vanessa blinked, clearly surprised. That's it? She asked. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. You already decided before dinner, I said. There's no point pretending this is a conversation. Daniel finally looked ashamed. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. I think this is best, he muttered. I nodded once and walked upstairs. The bedroom door was still the same pale blue Richard, painted for me 15 years earlier after I mentioned liking the color during a drive through Vermont in the fall. His reading glasses still sat on the nightstand. His slippers were still beside the bed. A cardigan still hung on the back of the chair near the window. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring at the rooms while the sound of Vanessa laughing downstairs echoed faintly through the floorboards. Then I pulled an old cardboard box from the closet and began folding Richard's clothes inside. Not because I wanted to leave, because I finally understood I was no longer living with family. I was living with people waiting for me to disappear. I barely slept that night. The guest room felt unfamiliar. Even though it had once belonged to Daniel when he was in high school, Vanessa had redecorated it. After moving in 2 years earlier, replacing the faded baseball posters with abstract beige paintings and scented candles that smelled like vanilla and cedar. Nothing about the room felt like my home anymore. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps downstairs. Quiet at first. Then cabinet doors, opening and closing. Vanessa. Even half asleep, I could recognize the sharp rhythm of her heels against the hardwood floor. I sat up slowly, pulling my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, while moonlight spilled through the curtains. For a moment, I considered going downstairs for water, but I didn't. Lately, moving around my own house had started feeling like trespassing. Instead, I stayed there listening to the muffled sounds below me while memories drifted through my mind like old photographs. Richard standing at the kitchen counter every Sunday morning making pancakes. Daniel racing down the stairs as a child in mismatched socks. Christmas mornings when wrapping paper covered the entire living room floor. 42 years of ordinary moments. That was the strange thing about losing a home. It wasn't the walls you mourned first. It was the life that had happened inside them. By 6:30, I gave up trying to sleep and went downstairs quietly. The kitchen lights were already on. Vanessa sat at the island scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee in front of her. Her silk robe looked expensive, pale cream with gold trim along the sleeves. She glanced up briefly when I entered. "Oh," she said flatly, "you're awake." Not good morning. Not how are you feeling. Just mild disappointment that I still existed in the space. I moved toward the coffee maker slowly. My joints always felt stiff in the mornings now, especially after emotional stress. Richard used to notice those little things immediately. "You need the good heating pad today," he'd say before I even mentioned the pain. Love lives in details like that. Or maybe it dies there too. Vanessa tapped her fingernails against the counter. "I was actually going to ask if you'd started packing yet." The words hung heavily in the air between us. I poured coffee carefully into Richard's old navy blue mug, the one with the chipped handle he refused to throw away, because Daniel painted it for him at a county fair when he was 8 years old. "No," I answered quietly. Her expression tightened slightly. "Well, the sooner you start, the easier this will be for everyone." Everyone. Another word people use when they don't want to admit who they're really protecting. I turned toward the window above the sink. Outside, the backyard looked peaceful in the early morning light. The oak tree Richard planted the summer Daniel was born stood tall near the fence, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Richard built the treehouse there himself when Daniel turned 10. I could still remember the sound of their laughter drifting through the yard while I carried lemonade outside on hot afternoons. Vanessa followed my gaze. The yard definitely needs work, she said casually. Daniel and I were thinking about tearing out the garden completely. Maybe putting in a fire pit area instead. My fingers tightened around the mug. The garden. Richard's garden. The one we spent 20 years planting together. Every rose bush had a story attached to it. Every hydrangea had been chosen during one of our weekend drives through small-town nurseries. Vanessa spoke about destroying it, the same way someone discusses changing curtains. I finally looked at her directly. You've already planned everything, haven't you? She didn't answer immediately. That told me enough. A small smile touched the corner of her mouth before disappearing again. We're just trying to think ahead. No, she'd been thinking ahead for a very long time. Suddenly, footsteps sounded behind us. Daniel entered the kitchen, wearing wrinkled sweatpants and rubbing his eyes tiredly. For one brief second, seeing him standing there half awake reminded me so much of the boy I raised that my chest physically hurt. Then Vanessa reached for his hand, and the moment vanished. You okay? He asked her softly. Her, not me. I was just talking to your mom about moving arrangements, she replied. Daniel nodded without looking directly at me. We should probably make a timeline. As if I were some storage issue needing organization. I stared at my son for several long seconds. You already have one, don't you? I asked quietly. Neither of them answered. That silence confirmed everything. The trip to Arizona, the room changes. The sudden conversations that stopped whenever I walked into a room. This hadn't been an emotional decision made during grief. This had been planned, carefully, slowly, probably months ago. A cold heaviness settled inside my stomach then, replacing the shock from the night before. Because betrayal always hurts differently once you realize how long it's been growing behind your back. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. We just think it's time for everyone to move forward. Move forward. Interesting phrase. People usually say that when they want someone else to quietly disappear from the picture. I set my coffee mug gently into the sink before speaking again. When exactly were you planning to tell me? I asked. Vanessa answered before Daniel could. We are telling you. Then she smiled. Polite, controlled, almost amused. And in that moment, standing in the kitchen, I once filled with birthday cakes, school lunches, and Thanksgiving dinners, I understood something painful for the very first time. I was no longer the mother of this home. I was merely the last obstacle, standing between Vanessa and the life she wanted. The rest of that morning passed in strange, uncomfortable silence. Daniel left for work around 8:30 without finishing his coffee. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek near the doorway, grabbed his laptop bag, and walked past me as though I were a distant relative visiting for the weekend, instead of the woman who raised him. See you tonight, he said softly. Not to me, to her. The front door closed behind him, and suddenly the house felt unbearably still. Vanessa remained in the kitchen for another few minutes, typing on her phone while humming quietly to herself. She seemed lighter now, relaxed, as if some long-awaited burden was finally about to disappear. Then she stood and adjusted the sleeve of her robe. Oh, one more thing, she said casually. The realtor is coming by tomorrow afternoon. I looked up from the sink. The realtor? Yes. She opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of sparkling water. We're thinking about renovating before the market slows down. Again. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel. You're selling the house? Vanessa shrugged lightly. Maybe eventually. Daniel wants something more modern. Open concept. Bigger windows. A cleaner layout. Cleaner. I glanced around the kitchen as she spoke. The handmade oak cabinets Richard installed himself. The tiny pencil marks near the pantry door, measuring Daniel's height year after year as he grew up. The old ceramic tile backsplash I picked out during the summer of 1998 because it reminded me of a cafe we visited in Charleston. Nothing in this room was accidental. This house carried our fingerprints everywhere. But to Vanessa, it was just property. Potential. Equity. Richard loved this kitchen, I said quietly before I could stop myself. Vanessa twisted the cap off her water bottle. Well, Richard also probably never imagined avocado green appliances would go out of style. Then she smiled at her own joke. Something cold moved through me then. Not anger exactly, just clarity. People reveal themselves most honestly in moments they think are harmless. She wasn't simply trying to remove me from the house. She was erasing him too. By lunchtime, I finally went upstairs to start packing. Not because I accepted what was happening. Because humiliation becomes unbearable once people start watching to see how much dignity you have left. I opened the bedroom closet slowly. Richard's shirts still hung exactly where he left them. Navy blue work jackets, plaid flannel shirts, the gray wool coat he wore every winter, even after I begged him to buy a new one. My chest tightened painfully. For several seconds, I simply stood there, breathing in the fading scent of his cologne, trapped inside the fabric. Then I reached for an empty box. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa talking loudly on the phone. Yes, finally, she laughed. We're getting the space back. I froze. Silence followed for a moment before her voice lowered slightly. No, she's taking it better than I expected. Another pause, then laughter again. Soft, careless, the kind of laughter people use when discussing inconveniences instead of human beings. I closed my eyes briefly. 42 years. 42 years of birthdays and scraped knees and family dinners and Christmas mornings. Reduced to getting the space back. I folded Richard's sweaters carefully into the box one at a time. The blue cashmere one Sophie gave him 3 years ago. The brown cardigan he wore every Thanksgiving. The old university sweatshirt with paint stains from when we remodeled the porch together. Every item felt heavier than it should have. Around 2 o'clock, I noticed something strange. The small, fireproof lockbox Richard kept in the closet was gone. I stopped moving immediately. My pulse quickened. That box had always stayed on the top shelf behind extra blankets. Richard kept important documents inside it. Insurance papers, tax records, a few legal files connected to his old construction company. He never hid it from me, but he rarely talked about what was inside. Slowly, I climbed onto the small step stool near the dresser and searched the shelf again. Nothing. I checked beneath winter coats, behind storage bins. Still nothing. A cold feeling settled low in my stomach. I walked downstairs carrying one of the boxes. Vanessa sat in the living room, scrolling through furniture ideas on her tablet. Have you seen Richard's lockbox? I asked carefully. Her eyes lifted toward me for only half a second. No, too fast, too smooth. He kept important documents in there, I continued. She shrugged. Maybe Daniel moved it. Why would he do that? Another small shrug. You'd have to ask him. Then she returned to her tablet. Conversation over. I stood there for several long seconds watching her. She looked perfectly comfortable sitting in my living rooms, surrounded by furniture. Richard and I spent decades paying for together. Comfortable enough to lie directly to my face without hesitation. That realization hurt more than I expected. Not because she lied. Because Daniel almost certainly knew about it. By evening, the bedroom looked different. Empty spaces had started appearing on shelves and inside drawers. The room no longer felt like a marriage. It felt like evidence being cleared away. As the sun disappeared outside the windows, I sat quietly on the edge of the bed, holding one of Richard's old watches in my hand. And for the very first time since his death, a thought entered my mind that I could no longer ignore. Maybe Richard knew something before he died. Maybe that lockbox disappeared because there was something inside it they didn't want me to see. I didn't go downstairs for dinner that evening. Not because anyone told me not to. Because sometimes humiliation changes the atmosphere of a house so completely that even walking into the same room feels unbearable. Instead, I stayed upstairs in the bedroom Richard and I had shared for most of our adult lives. The soft yellow lamp beside the bed cast long shadows across the walls while dusk settled quietly outside the windows. The room looked unfamiliar now. Half-packed boxes lined the closet wall. Empty spaces stared back at me from shelves that once held framed photographs and little souvenirs collected across decades of marriage. 42 years reduced to cardboard and tape. I picked up Richard's watch again, running my thumb slowly across the scratched silver band. He wore that watch every single day. Even after smartphones made watches unnecessary, Richard refused to stop wearing it. A man should always know what time it is, he used to joke. But Richard wasn't really talking about clocks. He believed in responsibility. Showing up when people needed you. Protecting your family, even when it cost you something. That was the kind of man he was. A memory surfaced then so clearly it almost hurt. It was the summer of 1984, just 2 weeks after we bought the house. The roof leaked every time it rained. The kitchen floor slanted slightly toward the back door. And we barely had enough money left after closing to buy groceries for the month. I still remember sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes, while Richard studied repair manuals borrowed from the library. "We'll fix it slowly," he told me with that calm smile of his. One room at a time. And we did. Over 42 years, we rebuilt nearly every inch of that house together. Richard installed the hardwood floors himself after working 10-hour construction shifts. I spent entire weekends repainting walls while Daniel played in the backyard with neighborhood kids. Every Christmas bonus, every tax return, every overtime paycheck. It all went into that home. Not because we cared about impressing anyone, because we wanted stability. A place where our family would always feel safe. I looked around the bedroom slowly. The pale blue walls, the old oak dresser, the handmade quilt folded at the foot of the bed. Nothing expensive, nothing glamorous. But every object carried history inside it. And now Vanessa talked about it, the way people discuss flipping investment properties online. Open concept. Better resale value. Modern upgrades. The language of people who had never attached memory to a place. Downstairs, I suddenly heard laughter again. Vanessa. Then Daniel's voice. Lower, more hesitant. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. Just temporary. She'll adjust. Arizona might actually be good. Their voices drifted upward through the vents, while I sat there staring at the wedding photo on my nightstand. Richard looked so young in that picture. Dark hair, broad shoulders, one hand resting gently against my waist, while we smiled at the camera outside the small church in Columbus where we got married. We were 26 years old. Poor, exhausted, completely in love, and absolutely certain we would spend the rest of our lives protecting each other. Tears finally burned my eyes then, though I refused to let them fall. Because grief changes over time. At first you cry because someone is gone. Later you cry because the world keeps moving, as if they never mattered at all. I set the photograph carefully into the box beside me. That was when I noticed the envelope. It had slipped partially behind the nightstand sometime earlier, hidden between the wall and the wooden leg of the table. Frowning slightly, I reached down and pulled it free. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting, Evelyn. Just that. No date. No explanation. My heart started beating harder immediately. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper. One sentence had been underlined heavily in blue ink. If anything ever feels wrong, call Martin before making any decisions. Martin Caldwell. Richard's attorney. I stared at the note for several seconds while a strange coldness spread through my chest. Richard had written this before he died. Not recently either. The ink looked slightly faded, like the note had been hidden there for quite some time. My mind immediately returned to the missing lockbox. The rushed conversations downstairs. The sudden pressure to remove me from the house. And for the first time since all this started, confusion gave way to suspicion. Real suspicion. Richard had never been paranoid, but he had been observant, especially when it came to people. I remembered one evening, nearly a year earlier, after Vanessa left the room during Thanksgiving dinner. Richard watched her walk into the kitchen before leaning toward me quietly. "She's always counting something," he muttered. I laughed at the time because I thought he meant money. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe he noticed things I ignored because I wanted peace too badly. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the bedroom windows. I folded Richard's note carefully and slipped it into my sweater pocket. Downstairs, Vanessa laughed again. But this time, hearing it didn't make me feel weak. It made me feel alert. Because suddenly, deep in my gut, I knew something important. Richard hadn't left me unprotected. And whatever was hidden inside that missing lockbox was important enough for someone, in this house, to make sure I never saw it. The next morning, I waited until Vanessa left the house before calling Martin Caldwell. I stood in the kitchen, holding Richard's note tightly in my hand while the phone rang. Outside,
gray clouds still hung low over the neighborhood from the storm the night before.
everything looked damp and colorless through the windows. For a moment, I almost hung up. Not because I was afraid of Martin. Because part of me still wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding. That grief had simply twisted ordinary family tension into something uglier in my mind. But then I remembered Vanessa laughing downstairs, while I packed Sean's husband's clothes into boxes. And the feeling passed. Martin Caldwell speaking. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Slower, rough around the edges. "Martin, it's Evelyn Harper." Silence filled the line for half a second. Then his tone softened immediately. "Evelyn," he said gently, "how are you holding up?" Nobody had asked me that sincerely in months. My throat tightened unexpectedly. "I found a note from Richard," I said carefully. "He told me to call you if something ever felt wrong." Another silence. Longer this time. "Can you come to my office?" Martin asked quietly. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. "I think it would be better if we spoke in person." By 11 o'clock, I was driving across town toward Martin's office downtown. The same office Richard used to visit twice a year to review business paperwork and tax documents. I remembered waiting for him afterward at the little diner nearby, where we always split a slice of lemon pie. Back then, life still felt solid, predictable, safe. Now, even traffic lights felt exhausting. Martin's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building near the courthouse. The receptionist recognized me immediately and offered a sad smile before leading me toward the back conference room. Martin stood when I entered. At 72, he looked thinner than I remembered. His silver hair had receded further, and deep lines framed his mouth. But his eyes remained sharp, very sharp. He waited until the door closed before speaking. "You found the note." It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly and handed it to him. Martin adjusted his glasses, studying Richard's handwriting quietly for several seconds before setting the paper carefully on the table. "When did things start changing at the house?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "You already know something changed." Martin leaned back in his chair heavily. Richard had concerns before he passed. A cold feeling spread through my chest. "Concerns about what?" He hesitated briefly. "Vanessa." The room suddenly felt smaller. I stared at him in disbelief. "Richard never said anything to me." "No," Martin replied quietly, "because he hoped he was wrong." I sat down slowly across from him. For the next several minutes, Martin asked gentle but specific questions. Had Daniel pressured me to move? Yes. Had financial documents disappeared? Yes. Did Vanessa suddenly start discussing renovations and property changes after Richard died? Yes. With every answer, Martin's expression darkened slightly. Finally, he folded his hands together. Evelyn, he said carefully, do you know whether Daniel ever mentioned transferring the house deed after Richard's death? No. Did anyone ask you to sign paperwork recently? My mind flashed immediately to 3 months earlier. Vanessa standing beside me at the dining room table, while Daniel hurried through a stack of papers connected to estate processing. My pulse quickened. There were some documents after the funeral, I admitted slowly. Daniel said they were routine. Martin's jaw tightened. Did you read them carefully? Shame flooded me instantly. No, because I trusted my son. Because grief makes people vulnerable in ways they don't even recognize. Martin exhaled slowly before standing and walking toward a large filing cabinet beside the wall. When he returned, he carried a thick blue folder.
Richard Harper Estate.
My hands started trembling slightly. Martin opened the folder carefully and removed several legal documents clipped together, neatly. Richard updated his trust 6 months before his death, he said. Trust, the word immediately made me uneasy. I don't understand.
You weren't supposed to need to, Martin replied softly.
Richard wanted to make sure you would always be protected. Protected from what? Before I could ask, Martin slid one document toward me. A single paragraph had been highlighted in yellow. I stared at the words, while my heartbeat pounded loudly in my ears. If Evelyn Harper is ever forcibly removed, manipulated, pressured into relocation, or denied permanent residence within the family property, all inheritance rights connected to the Harper estate shall immediately transfer to the Evelyn Harper Protection Trust. I looked up slowly. Martin's face remained calm, but his eyes told me everything. Daniel didn't own the house. Not completely. Maybe not at all. My mouth felt dry. Richard did this because of Vanessa? Martin chose his next words carefully. Richard believed Daniel was becoming financially dependent on her decisions. I sat frozen in silence. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the past 2 years rearranged themselves differently inside my head. Vanessa asking detailed questions about Richard's investments, her obsession with renovation costs, the way she monitored conversations anytime finances were mentioned. Even the rushed pressure after the funeral. It all felt different now, intentional, calculated. Martin lowered his voice slightly. There's something else missing from the house besides the lockbox, isn't there? I nodded slowly. The box disappeared yesterday. Martin became very still. Then he removed his glasses carefully. That's a problem, he said quietly. Outside the office window, rain began falling again over the city streets below. And for the first time since Richard died, I stopped feeling like a helpless old woman being pushed aside by her family. Because suddenly, the fear in my chest was changing into something else entirely. Awareness. And somewhere beneath that awareness, something colder had started waking up. I returned home just before 4 o'clock that afternoon. The sky had cleared after the rain, but the air still smelled damp and cold as I pulled into the driveway. For several seconds, I remained sitting inside the car with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Same white shutters. Same front porch swing Richard built 20 years ago. Same flower beds lining the walkway. But now I understood something painful. A house can stay physically unchanged while becoming emotionally unrecognizable. I spotted Vanessa's SUV immediately. She was home. Good. Part of me no longer wanted to avoid seeing her. Not after what Martin told me. Not after learning Richard spent the final months of his life quietly trying to protect me from the people living under his own roof. I stepped inside carefully. The sound of music drifted faintly from the kitchen. Vanessa stood near the counter, arranging fabric samples and paint cards across the granite island while speaking on speakerphone. No, definitely lighter floors, she laughed. Dark wood makes the place feel dated. Place. Not home. Place. The second she noticed me, her expression changed slightly. Not guilt, annoyance, like my presence interrupted something important. You're back early, she said, ending the call quickly. I suppose I am. Her eyes flicked briefly toward my purse. For the first time, I noticed how observant she really was. Always watching, always measuring. Where did you go? She asked casually. I removed my coat slowly before answering. Lunch, not technically a lie. Martin and I had stopped at the diner afterward, because suddenly neither of us wanted to continue discussing legal betrayal inside a quiet office. Over coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches, Martin explained more about Richard's concerns. Not suspicions, concerns. That distinction mattered. Richard never believed Vanessa was impulsive. He believed she was patient. And patient people are dangerous when money becomes involved. Vanessa folded her arms lightly now. You were gone a while. I met her eyes calmly. I didn't realize I needed permission. For a split second, something sharp flashed across her face. Then it disappeared behind another practiced smile. That's not what I meant. Of course it wasn't. People like Vanessa rarely say cruel things directly, unless they're absolutely certain they've already won. I walked past her toward the staircase. Halfway up, her voice stopped me. Oh, the realtor moved the appointment to Saturday. I paused. Why are you telling me that? So you won't be surprised when people start coming through the house. Coming through the house. As if strangers touring my life had already become inevitable. I continued upstairs without answering. The bedroom felt colder than before. Maybe because now every object inside it carried questions attached to it. What exactly had Richard discovered before he died? How long had he been worried? And most importantly, what was inside that missing lockbox? I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and pulled Richard's note from my sweater pocket again. Call Martin before making any decisions. Not leave. Not panic. Not confront anyone. Just call Martin. Richard chose his words carefully. That meant he expected pressure eventually. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I could answer, Sophie stepped quietly into the room. My granddaughter still wore her school backpack over one shoulder. Her long brown hair looked slightly messy from the wind outside. For a moment, seeing her made my chest ache. Because Sophie still looked at me the same way she always had. Like family. Mom said the realtor's coming, she said softly. I nodded once, so I heard. Sophie hesitated near the doorway. Then she lowered her voice. I heard them talking last night. Something inside me tightened immediately. Talking about what? She shifted uncomfortably. Dad asked Mom if they should wait longer before making you leave. That surprised me. Not enough to erase his betrayal, but enough to hurt differently. And what did Vanessa say? Sophie looked down at the floor. She said if they waited too long, you might change the paperwork situation. My pulse slowed strangely. Not from fear, from confirmation. Vanessa knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Carefully, I reached for Sophie's hand. Sweetheart, I said quietly. Has your father been looking for something lately? Papers, maybe? She nodded immediately. He was in your closet yesterday. The room went completely still. And? I asked. Sophie swallowed hard. I saw him carrying Grandpa's metal box. There it was. The truth. Not suspicion anymore. Not paranoia created by grief. Daniel took the lockbox. My own son. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie looked at me with tears gathering in her eyes. Grandma, are you really leaving? The question nearly broke me. Not because of the house, because children always notice the truth adults try to hide. She knew something ugly was happening here. I squeezed her hand, gently. I don't know yet. And for the first time since this nightmare began, that answer was actually to be true. Because now I understood something. Vanessa and Daniel didn't realize yet. They thought they were removing a grieving old woman from the house. But Richard had already prepared for this long before either of them made their first move. And if Daniel really took that lockbox, then somewhere inside this house was a secret important enough to make my own son betray me for it. That night, I stopped packing. Not because I suddenly felt hopeful. Because hope and awareness are two very different things. Until that afternoon, I believed I was simply an unwanted widow, being quietly pushed aside after her husband's death. Painful, yes. Cruel, certainly, but sadly common. Now I understood there was something else underneath it, something hidden. And hidden things change the shape of a story. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa moving around the kitchen while cabinet doors opened and closed sharply. Daniel still hadn't come home from work yet, though it was already after 7. Or maybe he was avoiding me. That possibility no longer hurt the way it had before. Once betrayal becomes visible, sadness slowly starts making for clarity. I sat at the bedroom desk, staring at the old family photo beside the lamp. Daniel was 12 in that picture. Skinny arms, crooked smile. His baseball cap turned backward because he thought it made him look older. Richard stood behind him, with both hands resting proudly on his shoulders. Back then, our son still looked at his father like he hung the moon. I wondered when exactly that changed. Maybe after Vanessa entered his life. Maybe long before that. Money reveals weaknesses that love often hides. A soft vibration pulled me from my thoughts. My phone. Martin, I answered immediately. Hello? Evelyn, he said quietly. I need to ask you something carefully. Something in his tone made me sit straighter. All right. Did Daniel ever ask Richard detailed questions about the trust before he passed? I thought back slowly. At first, nothing came to mind. Then suddenly, a memory surfaced. 3 months before Richard died, Daniel came over for dinner alone, while Vanessa attended some charity event downtown. The two men spent nearly an hour in Richard's workshop afterward, talking privately. At the time, I thought it was about finances connected to the construction company. Now I wasn't so sure. Yes, I said slowly. There was one conversation. Martin became quiet for a second. That matters. Why? Because someone accessed part of the trust records 2 weeks after Richard's funeral. A chill spread through my body. Accessed? Someone requested copies. I gripped the phone tighter. Daniel? I can't confirm that over the phone, Martin replied carefully. But whoever did it already knew exactly which documents to ask for. My stomach tightened. Not random curiosity, not confusion after a death. Specific documents, specific information, carefully targeted. Martin lowered his voice further. Evelyn, I think your husband suspected someone would try to challenge the trust after he passed. I closed my eyes briefly. Richard knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to prepare. Enough to hide notes behind furniture. And strengthen legal protections quietly, without alarming me. The thought both comforted and devastated me. Even near the end of his life, Richard was still trying to shield me from pain. I found something else today, I admitted softly. The lockbox? No. Sophie told me Daniel took it. Silence filled the line immediately. When Martin finally spoke again, his tone had hardened noticeably. That box contains original trust amendments. My pulse quickened. And if those papers disappear? They won't erase the trust, Martin replied calmly. But they could delay proceedings, cause confusion, buy time. Buy time. That phrase settled heavily in my chest. Time for what? To sell the house? Transfer assets? Pressure me into signing something else? Suddenly, every interaction over the past several months felt darker than before. Vanessa constantly asking whether I plan to downsize. Daniel encouraging me to simplify my finances after Richard died. Even the sudden urgency to relocate me to Arizona. None of it was random. It was strategy. I don't know my son anymore, I whispered before I could stop myself. Martin's voice softened slightly. Grief changes people, Evelyn. No, I said quietly. Greed changes people. The words hung between us. Painfully true. After we ended the call, I remained sitting in silence for several long minutes. Then headlights swept across the bedroom wall outside. Daniel was home. A minute later, I heard voices downstairs, Vanessa speaking first. Quick, low, urgent. Then Daniel answering sharply. Not yelling exactly, but tense, very tense. I stood carefully and moved closer to the bedroom door without making noise. She went somewhere today, Vanessa whispered. So what?
You think that's coincidence?
Daniel sighed heavily. She doesn't know anything. A pause. Then Vanessa again. Are you sure the box was still full? My entire body went cold. Daniel answered too quickly. Yes, not confusion, not denial. Confirmation. He took it. There was no question anymore. I stepped backwards slowly from the door, before the floorboards could creak beneath my feet. My hands were trembling now, but not from fear, from realization. Because suddenly, the situation felt much larger than family cruelty or inheritance arguments. My son and his wife were hiding something important enough to steal legal documents from a grieving widow. And if Richard went through the trouble of building protections into the trust, then maybe he understood one terrifying thing before I did. The real danger in this house never came from losing him. It came afterward. A knock suddenly sounded at the bedroom door. I quickly sat back down near the bed, just as Daniel stepped quietly inside. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted, older somehow, like guilt had started settling into his face. Mom, he said carefully, can we talk? I looked at my son for a very long moment before answering. And for the first time in my entire life, I realized something heartbreaking. I no longer knew whether the man standing in front of me was someone I could trust. Daniel closed the bedroom door quietly behind him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt unfamiliar now, heavy, careful, like two strangers trying not to step on hidden landmines. He stayed near the doorway, instead of coming farther into the room. That alone told me something. When Daniel was younger, he always moved toward me naturally, sat beside me during difficult conversations, reached for comfort without thinking. Now he kept his distance. Mom, he said finally, rubbing the back of his neck, I know things have been tenses. Interesting word for what they were doing to me. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. You mean forcing me out of my home? His jaw tightened slightly. That's not fair. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because people become very sensitive to fairness the moment consequences begin approaching them. Daniel exhaled heavily and sat down in the chair near the window. It's just. He paused carefully. Vanessa and I are trying to plan for the future. There it was again. Future. As if I belonged entirely to the past now. I studied my son quietly beneath the soft bedroom light. He looked tired, dark circles beneath his. Wrinkles near his forehead that hadn't been there a year ago. Stress had settled into him deeply. But guilt had too. You took Richard's lockbox, I said calmly. The reaction was immediate. Tiny but immediate. His shoulders stiffened before he could control it. Then his expression carefully flattened again. What? The metal lockbox from the closet. Daniel looked away too quickly. I moved some things after Dad died. Not denial, just explanation. My chest tightened painfully. Because lies from strangers hurt differently than lies from your own child.
Why?
I asked softly. I was organizing paperwork. Another partial truth. I could hear it in his voice now. That hesitation people use when they're trying to stand close enough to honesty, to feel less guilty. Where is it? Daniel stood abruptly and walked toward the window. You don't need to worry about legal documents right now. The words settled coldly between us. Legal documents. Not family memories. Not old business records. He knew exactly what mattered inside that box. I watched rainwater slide slowly down the glass outside while my son avoided looking at me. Then, very quietly, I asked the question that had been sitting inside my chest all evening. Did Vanessa ask you to take it? Daniel turned sharply. No. Too fast. Too emotional. Another answer that revealed more than it hid. I nodded slowly. The room fell silent again. Downstairs, I could faintly hear Vanessa moving dishes around in the kitchen. Every small sound carried upward through the house, with uncomfortable clarity now. Finally, Daniel spoke again. You think the worst of us now, don't you? Us. Always us. I looked at him carefully. When your father died, I said softly, I thought losing him would be the hardest part of my life. Daniel's eyes finally met mine then. And now? I swallowed carefully before answering. Now I'm not so sure. Pain flickered across his face for a brief second. Real pain. Because, despite everything, part of him still understood what they were doing was wrong. But weakness can be just as destructive as cruelty when left unchecked. Daniel sat back down, slowly. You don't understand the pressure we're under, he muttered. Pressure. Money again. Bills. Lifestyle. Debt maybe. Vanessa always loved expensive things, new furniture, luxury vacations. Designer handbags she casually left on countertops like magazines. Richard noticed it too. I understood that now. What kind of pressure? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated, then immediately looked regretful for speaking at all. That's not the point. No, that was exactly the point. Because suddenly, the pieces were fitting together so differently. The rushed relocation. The missing lockbox. The realtor. The trust documents. None of this was emotional. It was financial. A loud laugh suddenly echoed from downstairs, Vanessa. Daniel closed his eyes briefly in frustration. She's having wine with Melissa, he said tiredly. Her friend stopped by. I hadn't even heard the front door open. The thought of Vanessa casually entertaining guests downstairs while discussing my removal from the house made something inside me go strangely still. Daniel rose again. We'll figure this out, he said quietly near the door. I almost asked him what we meant anymore. But I didn't. Because sometimes people reveal more when you stop helping them feel comfortable. After he left, I remained sitting silently in the bedroom for several minutes, before eventually walking downstairs for water. Voices drifted from the dining room. Vanessa and her friend. The whole place will feel so much bigger once the upstairs is cleared out. Vanessa laughed. My fingers tightened around the staircase railing. Melissa lowered her voice slightly. And she's actually leaving? She doesn't really have a choice, Vanessa replied smoothly. Then another laugh. Soft. Confident. Certain. I stayed frozen halfway down the stairs listening carefully. I swear, Vanessa continued, Daniel would drag this out for months if I hadn't pushed him. Melissa snorted quietly. Well, at least once the house sells, all this stress pays off. Sell. Not renovate. Sell. A cold wave moved through my body. Because suddenly, Martin's warning made terrifying sense. They weren't simply trying to move me out. They were trying to move fast. Fast enough to finish whatever plan they'd already started before anyone stopped them. I stepped backward carefully before they could see me standing there. Then I returned upstairs without making a sound. And for the first time since Richard died, I stopped feeling heartbroken. Heartbreak requires trust. What I felt now was something colder. I was being maneuvered by my own family. And somewhere beneath all their fake concern and polite smiles, Time was running out for them. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For a few quiet seconds, I forgot everything. Then I saw the half-packed boxes near the closet wall, and reality settled back over me like cold water. Outside, the neighborhood remained dark and silent. Streetlights glowed faintly through the bedroom curtains, while rainwater still dripped from the gutters below. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding Richard's note in my hands again. Call Martin before making any decisions. Not panic, not confront, not accuse. Richard knew me well enough to understand my first instinct would always be preserving peace, even at my own expense. But peace inside a dishonest house is just another form of surrender. At 9 o'clock, Martin called. I need you downtown this morning, he said immediately. His tone sounded different now, more urgent. Did something happen? I asked quietly. Yes. My stomach tightened. Martin lowered his voice slightly. The trust records were accessed again last night. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. By Daniel? I still can't legally confirm that, Martin replied carefully. But whoever it was requested property transfer information specifically tied to the house. Property transfer. The words landed heavily inside my chest. Vanessa wasn't planning renovations. She was planning liquidation. Fast liquidation. How quickly can they sell? I asked. Not legally without triggering the trust protections, Martin answered. But they may not realize that yet. Or maybe they did. Maybe that was why they were rushing, trying to move assets before consequences caught up to them. I closed my eyes briefly. My own son, the little boy who used to save allowance money to buy me birthday flowers from the grocery store, now secretly pulling trust documents behind my back. I need you to listen carefully, Martin continued. Do not sign anything. No relocation agreements, no financial authorizations, nothing. I understand. And Evelyn? Yes, if they feel pressure building, people make mistakes. After the call ended, I remained sitting quietly for several minutes. Then I finally stood and walked downstairs. Vanessa was already dressed for the day in fitted white pants and a cream sweater, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. She stood near the island reviewing papers spread neatly across the counter, realtor documents. She quickly flipped one page over when she noticed me. Too late. I'd already seen the words property evaluation across the top. Morning, she said lightly. I poured coffee without answering immediately. Funny how silence unsettles manipulative people more than anger does. Finally, she smiled tightly. Daniel said you seemed upset last night. Upset. Another small word people use to minimize betrayal. I'm grieving, I replied calmly. There's a difference. Something flickered behind her eyes then. Not sympathy. Calculation. She leaned casually against the counter. You know, Evelyn, holding on to a house this large alone isn't realistic forever. There it was again, not emotional concerns. Management. Everything she said sounded like someone handling a transaction. I turned slowly toward her. Have you already chosen where you'd like my furniture moved? For the first time in days, her composure cracked slightly. Only slightly. I'm trying to help. No, I said quietly. You're trying to hurry. The kitchen fell completely silent. Vanessa's expression hardened. Just for a second. Then the mask returned. You're being paranoid. Maybe. But paranoid people don't usually discover missing lockboxes and hidden trust protections. I carried my coffee toward the living room without another word. Halfway there, I noticed something sitting near the front door. A stack of printed brochures. Luxury Active Senior Communities. My chest went cold, not because of the brochures themselves, because they'd already started preparing replacements for my life before I had even agreed to leave it. I picked one up slowly. Smiling gray-haired couples stared back at me from glossy pages, beneath words like freedom and simplified living. It felt obscene somehow, like grief being marketed. Behind me, Vanessa spoke carefully. We thought you might want options. We, always we. I turned toward her, holding the brochure loosely in my hand. Then I noticed something else. Near the bottom corner of the top page sat Daniel's handwriting. A small note, scribbled quickly in blue ink. Ask about immediate openings. For several seconds, the room tilted slightly around me. Immediate. Not someday. Not eventually. Immediately. Suddenly, everything became painfully clear. They weren't simply planning my future. They had already scheduled it. And, standing there in the living room, Richard spent decades building around us. I finally understood the truth. I'd been avoiding since the night Vanessa laughed while I packed boxes upstairs. This was never about helping me move forward. They were trying to erase me before I realized what they had done. That afternoon, I stopped pretending to be confused. Not publicly, not dramatically. But internally, something shifted. For days, I had moved through the house like a grieving widow, trying to understand why her family suddenly felt cold. I kept searching for misunderstandings, for excuses, for small traces of the son I raised. Now all that uncertainty was gone. What remained was truth. Daniel and Vanessa were trying to remove me from the house as quickly as possible before I discovered what Richard left behind. And worse than that, they thought I was too weak to notice. Around 3 o'clock, the realtor arrived. Her name was Karen, mid-50s, bright smile, expensive handbag. The kind of woman trained to compliment kitchens, while quietly calculating square footage in her head. Vanessa greeted her at the front door with the excitement of someone unveiling a new vacation property. "I'm so glad you could come," she said warmly. "Not our home. Not Richard's home. A property. An opportunity." I remained seated in the living room while they walked through the downstairs together, discussing renovations. Natural light is a huge selling point. The backyard has excellent potential. Updated flooring would increase value immediately. Every sentence felt like listening to strangers perform an autopsy on my marriage. Karen eventually glanced toward me politely. "And you must be Evelyn?" I nodded once. Vanessa answered before I could speak. "She's transitioning to a senior community soon." Transitioning. Such a clean little word for being pushed out of your life. Karen smiled sympathetically. "Well, these things are never easy. No. But betrayal should at least have the decency to be honest." I stood quietly and excused myself before they could continue discussing my future like a scheduling conflict. Upstairs, I closed the bedroom door softly behind me and sat beside the window. Outside, late afternoon, sunlight stretched across the backyard. Richard loved so much. The garden still bloomed despite everything happening inside the house. Hydrangeas along the fence. White roses near the porch. The small stone birdbath Daniel made in middle school during a summer art class. Richard kept it all alive for years. Even during chemotherapy treatments near the end, he still insisted on watering the roses himself. "Healing things matters," he once told me quietly while kneeling in the dirt beside the garden beds. At the time, I thought he meant flowers. Now I wondered if he meant people too. A sudden knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I answered, the door opened slightly. Sophie stepped inside. Her expression looked tense. "Grandma," she whispered, "Dad's arguing with Mom downstairs." I immediately sat upright. "About what?" "She wants him to sign something today." My pulse slowed instantly. Not panic. Focus. "Did you hear what it was?" Sophie shook her head. "But Dad said maybe they should wait."
Interesting.
For the first time since all this started, I saw a crack forming between them. Vanessa wanted speed. Daniel wanted reassurance. That difference mattered. Carefully, I stood and walked toward the hallway. Voices drifted faintly upward from downstairs. Already delayed long enough. Vanessa. Sharp. Controlled. Then Daniel. "Martin's asking questions now?" Silence followed. Then Vanessa again, lower this time. "So? The house is practically as are already." Practically, not legally, which meant she knew enough to be nervous. I remained perfectly still near the staircase, while my heartbeat echoed steadily in my ears. Daniel's voice dropped further. What if Dad changed more than we realized? There it was, fear. Finally, Vanessa answered immediately. He didn't, but she sounded too quick. Too defensive, like someone trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. Then, footsteps moved suddenly toward the hallway. I stepped backward silently before either of them could see me listening. Back inside the bedroom, I closed the door carefully and leaned against it for several seconds. My hands trembled slightly now. Not from grief anymore, from realization. They were losing control. Martin asking questions frightened them. The trust frightened them. And whatever Richard placed inside that lockbox frightened them most of all. For the first time since Richard died, I finally understood why he left me that note. He wasn't warning me about loneliness. He was warning me about survival. Downstairs, I heard the front door slam hard enough to shake the walls. Then silence. A few moments later, Sophie knocked softly again before peeking into the room. Dad left, she whispered. I nodded slowly. And your mother? Of course she was. I walked toward the window again and stared out at the darkening backyard while evening. Shadows stretched across the lawn. Somewhere deep inside me, grief was beginning to change shape. Not disappearing, never disappearing, but hardening into something steadier. Because, slowly, piece by piece, the people who thought they were removing me from the story were beginning to realize something dangerous. Richard Harper had prepared for this, long before any of us understood why. Daniel didn't come home that night. Vanessa pretended not to care. She sat alone in the dining room, with a half-empty glass of wine beside her phone, while soft jazz played from the kitchen speaker. Every now and then, she checked the front window whenever headlights passed outside. Waiting. Even people who crave control eventually become afraid once they realize they may not actually have it. I stayed upstairs. Around 10 o'clock, my phone vibrated quietly beside the bed. A message from Martin. We need to meet tomorrow morning. I found something important. Don't discuss anything with Daniel or Vanessa tonight. My stomach tightened immediately. Found something. I stared at the message for several long seconds before locking the phone again. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows, while the old oak tree swayed in the darkness beyond the yard. Richard loved storms. He used to sit on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket listening to rain hit the roof for hours. Storms reveal weak foundations. He once told Daniel when he was little. That's how you know what actually needs fixing. Back then, I thought he was talking about houses. Now I understood. He was talking about people too. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I answered, the bedroom door opened slowly. Daniel stepped inside. He looked exhausted. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his eyes were red from either stress or late scoops. Maybe both. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly closed the door behind him. Mom, he said softly, I need to ask you something. I remained seated near the window. What is it? He hesitated. Not because he didn't know what to say, because he was deciding how much truth to admit. Finally, he looked down at the floor. Did you talk to Martin? There it was, not concern for me, fear. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Yes, Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The reaction told me more than words ever could. How much did he tell you? He asked carefully. Enough. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Painful. Then Daniel sat slowly in the chair across from me. The same chair Richard used to sit in every evening while reading before bed. The sight almost hurt. He changed things before he died, Daniel muttered quietly. Not a question. A realization. I nodded once. Yes. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face in frustration. You don't understand, he whispered. Vanessa thought. I stopped him gently. No, Daniel, I said softly. Vanessa hoped. You chose. That sentence landed hard. I saw it immediately in his face. Because weakness always depends on blaming stronger personalities nearby. But weakness still makes decisions. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then finally, his voice cracked slightly. We're drowning financially. I looked at my son quietly while years of memories moved through my mind all at once. First bicycle, college graduation, his wedding day, the night Richard carried him into the emergency room, after he broke his arm playing baseball at 14. Every version of him still existed somewhere inside my heart. Even this one. What happened? I asked gently. Daniel stared toward the dark window. After Dad died, Vanessa said selling the house would solve everything. Debt, loans, credit cards. He swallowed hard. She said you'd be happier somewhere easier anyway. There it was. The justification. People rarely survive betrayal without building stories that allow them to sleep afterward. I listened quietly, while my son finally looked at me again for the first time in days. And suddenly he didn't look manipulative. He looked scared. Scared people make dangerous choices. But they also make honest ones. Did you take the lockbox? I asked calmly. Daniel's shoulders lowered slowly. Then he nodded. One small movement. That was all. But somehow, it still broke my heart. Because confession changes pain into certainty. I'm sorry, he whispered. I believed he meant it. And strangely, that made everything sadder. I stood carefully and walked toward the bedroom door before stopping beside him. You didn't lose yourself all at once, Daniel, I said quietly. It happened one excuse at a time. His eyes filled immediately. But I didn't comfort him. Some grief belongs to the person who created it. As I reached for the door handle, I paused one final time. Then softly, without anger, I said, the truth neither of us could avoid anymore. You were so afraid of losing this house. I looked around the room Richard and I built together over 4 decades. You never realized you were losing your family instead. The next morning, I met Martin at the diner Richard, and I used to visit after his appointments downtown. Same cracked leather booths, same smell of coffee and buttered toast. Same waitress who still called me Han every time she refilled my cup. Strange how ordinary places survive, while entire families fall apart. Martin arrived, carrying a thick folder beneath one arm. He looked tired, but calmer than the day before. As soon as he sat down, he slid several papers across the table toward me. The original trust amendments were officially filed years ago. He said quietly. Even if the lockbox disappeared completely, the legal protections still stand. I stared at the documents silently. Relief should have been the first thing I felt. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired of realizing how much preparation Richard quietly made before he died. Tired of understanding how badly things must have worried him near the end. He knew, I whispered. Martin nodded slowly. He hoped he was wrong, he said gently. But he prepared anyway. Outside, the diner window, morning sunlight stretched across the wet sidewalks while people hurried through ordinary lives, completely unaware that mine had split apart almost overnight. Martin folded his hands together carefully. There's one more thing, he said. I looked up. The trust gives you full residential authority over the property for the remainder of your life. Daniel and Vanessa cannot legally remove you. A strange silence settled inside me then. Not victory, not satisfaction, just stillness. Because suddenly, after days of fear and humiliation, I realized something important. I no longer wanted to stay there. Not in that house. Not inside rooms poisoned by whispers and hidden paperwork and careful betrayals. Home is more than walls. And mine had already been broken long before anyone packed a single box. When I returned that afternoon, the house felt unusually quiet. Vanessa sat alone in the living room, scrolling through her phone. The moment she saw the folder in my hands, her expression changed instantly. Fear. Real fear this time. "Where's Daniel?" I asked calmly. "At work." I nodded once. Then I placed the folder gently on the coffee table between us. "You should probably read those," I said softly. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the documents. I watched the color slowly drain from her face, line by line. For once, she had nothing clever to say. No smooth explanations. No polished smile. Just silence. The kind that comes when people finally realize they misunderstood who actually held power all along. "I'm not fighting you for the house," I said quietly. Her eyes lifted toward me immediately, confused, suspicious, almost desperate. "I don't understand," she whispered. And strangely, I believed that. Because people like Vanessa understand ownership. They understand leverage, but they rarely understand peace. I looked around the living room one final time. Richard's favorite chair near the fireplace. The old clock still ticking steadily against the wall. Family photographs lining shelves that suddenly felt very far away from me. "I spent 42 years building a life here," I said softly. "I won't spend whatever time I have left defending it from my own family." Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes then, but this time I let them come. Not for the house. For Richard. For Daniel. For the family we used to be before greed hollowed it out from the inside. A week later, I moved into a small cottage near Patricia in Arizona. Quiet neighborhood. Warm evenings. A little garden in the backyard where I planted white roses beside the porch. Sophie still calls me every Sunday. Daniel calls too sometimes. I answer when I'm ready. Healing, I've learned, doesn't always mean repairing relationships. Sometimes it simply means refusing to let bitterness become your final home. And on certain mornings, when sunlight pours through my kitchen windows, while coffee brews softly nearby, I sit in silence and feel something I thought I lost forever after Richard died. Peace. Sometimes the deepest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people who once called you family. I spent months believing I was losing my home. But in the end, I realized something far more important. A house built with love can survive greed, but a family built on selfishness eventually collapses on its own. Richard protected me the best way he knew how. And now, for the first time in years, I'm finally learning how to protect my own peace too.